All right. I am looking for one more window. All right, there we go. So far in React, you have, what have you covered so far in React?
Components and
Use,
states.
okay, components and states. And I'm guessing you've only gone over functional components, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yep.
Okay. If neither Umar or Jordan made this clear, functional components are essentially the way to go. The React development team have been advocating for functional components over the old school class components for a long time now. Even like the current documentation on React is pretty much all about functional components. Support exists for class components just for backwards compatibility, but honestly, I can't imagine too many use cases in which you'll want to invest time wrestling with the complications and complexity of class components. They utilize things like what is it called? Um, State life cycles and constructors, and it's just a lot more verbose than functional components. We'll go over that in a bit more detail at the end of this slide deck, and maybe I'll even run through a demonstration in React. But for the most part, we'll be playing around with functional components. Today, we're introducing the property, properties, props, basically. These are how data is passed around between components in React. So you've learned about state yesterday, and you've learned that state is essentially mutable only within the component that it exists. So for data to be passed between one component to another, it can't be passed as a state. It has to be passed as a property. When React components are called, they receive that prop as a single argument. And props are essentially objects that can contain multiple key value pairs. So you could kind of think about them like dictionaries. And the last thing to remember about them is that they are immutable. So props are passed into other components as JSX. So within the return expression of a component, they're, like in this example here, passed in as key value pairs inside of profile. So this function component is passing name and image URL to the profile component. From there, the profile component needs to have props listed in the parentheses where it's being defined. And from there, the elements of those props can be called, again, in JSX. So we have props.name and props.image URL, just like in the previous slide where they were passed in. You can also destructure props. And what this means is to essentially write them in a slightly different syntax where you are able to see the key and value pairs more directly. So this can make programming a little more easier if you tend to have or work with props that have a lot of information between components. Ideally, your component shouldn't be getting so massive that they're juggling all sorts of values inside single prop objects, but this is another way of passing them around. So in this example here, instead of passing key value pairs like we saw a few slides ago, we have the key value pairs inside a single key value pair of props. Props is the key, and the value is essentially this dictionary containing the elements of that properties object. And when the component is receiving these, similarly, we see these keys inside the parentheses where they are being defined as parameters to pass in. So we have name, comma, image URL, referencing the name and image URL in the screen cap above it. Now, when you call them this way, you no longer have to type props in front of them when you call them inside the JSX. So here you see we're calling name, we're calling image URL, whereas in the last slide, we were calling props.name, props.image URL. Both ways are perfectly acceptable ways of passing props down. It really boils down to preference. We will also be looking at ternaries, which you're already familiar with outside of React, but in React, they are extremely valuable. React being highly reactive, the whole idea behind React is that it's dynamic and it updates immediately. Ternaries are a godsend. They essentially work in place of otherwise long if-else statements, and this is how you will primarily implement conditional rendering within React. Here we have a profile where we are passing in name and image URL. We are returning a div with a class name of profile. And within this, we have a ternary where if this image URL exists and its length is equal to 0, that's a very strange ternary, then if that was true, the image source would use the image URL. If it wasn't true, it would be null. I'm looking at this example and it looks like it kind of doesn't make sense. I think this example would make more sense if the second part of this first expression was image URL.length does not equal 0, because we would want the length to be greater than 0 to essentially validate it as a properly working URL. But you get the gist of it. Basically, it's a ternary like you've already seen. If the expression renders as true, the first part of the second half of the ternary will render, which in this case is the image source being mapped to the image URL. And if it's false, the second half of this ternary is what renders, and in this case, it is null. So ternaries are used in place of if-else statements. And this is an example of what they would look like inside a class component instead of a functional component on the left. So on the right side, we have a class component that uses extend, because with class components, you have to extend the React component. This is what I was referring to when I was saying class components are more verbose than functional components. You have to use the render function before you could call your return. And then within that render function, you are defining your props. So we have is muted, toggle mute as constants mapped to the props of this mute button class component. And then finally, within the return, you have a very similar syntax for the ternary between these two components. So class components just have a bit more setup. They're a little more tedious in that regard. Some of the other differences between the two is that functional components are essentially pure JavaScript functions that return JSX. Class components require extending of the React component and the use of the render method to be able to return JSX. Functional components can be thought of as stateless, whereas class components are stateful because they live through the use of various lifecycle methods. So lifecycle methods would include like in instantiation upon load, whereas functional components, when they're called, they're just called. They run from top to bottom, and then that's it. Finally, the only other difference is functional components will utilize these built-in hooks like useEffect and useStates for simple prop and state creation, whereas constructors are required within class components. Again, class components are more verbose, they're tedious, they're clunky, they're messy, they are dated. You'll primarily want to work with functional components. All right, any questions? Cool. Let me switch to VS Code and we can run through some React Live. Actually, no, I'm going to share the entire desktop. Let's go to that. Okay, can you see this? Cool. Let's take a look at what this looks like right now. I think, let me exit out of this. Let me run this again. This is what we will be demoing today. It's a very simple React app where we use a ternary and state to load and unload a portfolio. The portfolio will consist of job history and a name and title, which right now is not rendering. I might have, let's see, here's my profile. Oh, I see. Yeah, I was playing around with regular props versus destructured props. So let me zoom in here. When it wasn't rendering just a second ago, I still had the second line commented in. In this line here, we're passing props in the way that we would if we wanted to destructure them. But where I'm calling these props, they are not being destructured. That would be this example down here. So going back to this first syntax, we have a title and a name rendering, and we are utilizing a ternary. Where's the ternary? It's, oh, right, it's up here to either load or unload portfolio. So let's see what this looks like built from scratch. Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to get out of here. Let's make sure we're in directory. Actually, wow. Let's make a fresh new React app. And we are going to call this not a demo app, very creative. I think you should have already been introduced to this command. I will paste it inside of our Slack chat, or not Slack, sorry, Zoom chat. Or I'll also open it up here because so when you're calling Vite, I don't know if did you guys use Vite yet?
Yeah, we've been using that from the start.
Cool. All right, so you're already familiar with Vite. Let's use Vite to create our new React app. It's going to ask me for a name. I'm going to say demo app 2. I'm going to select React, select JavaScript. Now I'm going to cd into this new folder, and I am going to run npm install. Cool. Close this out. Let's now see what we have. Should have our
You have to npm install again with V for some reason.
really
Yeah, it's weird.
do it twice. I think I had to do that yesterday, but let's see.
Hmm.
That is weird.
Did you CD into the folder already?
Thought I did.
Looks like it.
Could you zoom in a bit more?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh yeah, that's much better. Hmm. Did you? I didn't see the first command that you ran. Was it just npm create v?
Yeah, I think it was.
It didn't look like it asked you to name the project or anything, did it?
It did. Here, let's start over. Open one directory, let's open another. Let's just remove this altogether. Okay. I'll just make, I don't know, a day 3 folder, and we'll do a fresh npm create. So we're gonna call npm create the latest. Let's give it a simpler name. Select React and JavaScript. Now I'm gonna cd into this directory. I'm gonna run npm install. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this will work. Wow. Not redefined property files. Strange.
Huh. Do you in
That's
the
weird.
parent directory, have you already done all this stuff, maybe?
I should be in a clean directory. I did it in a separate folder.
I wonder if you've done it in like a parent directory and
Yeah. Maybe.
doesn't seem like
A fresh folder. So let's go into this fresh folder. Let's try this again. This folder is empty. I'm gonna call npm create. Okay.
Hmm.
Now that is really weird. Yeah, very strange considering how I just ran through this last night. I don't think I have. I have no issues in my existing folder. Yeah, I
I
really
wonder
have.
if it's trying to use the same server.
Yeah, but the server was closed though. I had exited out.
Oh, okay.
So that's strange. Well, so maybe instead of creating a fresh new app, let's just walk through what we have here. And let's start with I wanted to walk through it in a way that would, you could see how it was set up fresh, because some of what I did for this example is what you're going to be using in the challenges today. Like, for example, we have inside of this assets folder, I created this constants.js file. This is basically a file, a simple JavaScript file that has things that I've imported and things that I can export. So here, where we have the experiences created, it's all hard-coded here. So this could just be passed to our app.jsx component. And then we have a technologies object or a list here of objects with names and icons. These icons are being imported from an icons folder. And within this icons folder, I have these icons. And within this folder as well is an index.js where I am importing from these PNGs and I am exporting them. So that was the setup for this folder of images and for this list of, I guess, key value pairs that I use for the work history of the portfolio. And then within the app.jsx, we were to maybe pretend that this doesn't exist, this doesn't exist, a lot of this doesn't exist. So we could kind of comment it back in one by one. Ooh, it doesn't like that either. I'm going to delete this. Then I'll comment this out. Yeah, let's just try to run through this. It's as is, and we're not going to be able to create a fresh project because that's going to take up too much time to troubleshoot. So let's just code it straight from here. So if we were to open this up right now, I think it should still render. Let's find out. It's rendering, no errors, and it's just an empty page. Let's take a look at what's in here. Yep, it looks like everything's fine. Basically, it's running, but since we're not returning anything within app, none of these other components are being called. So the first thing we wanted to do was to create the profile component, and that's what this is. In the profile component, we are accepting properties as props, and we have a return expression with a div, and within this div, we have a header 1 and a header 2, using header 1 for the name that we're passing in, and then header 2 for the title. Back in the app component where we are passing these props from, we were going to have, let's ignore the ternary for now, and let's just start with the profile. We would be calling profile through some JSX, and we would be passing in values for the props that we wanted to use. So let's say Bruce Wayne is a full stack web developer. We type it out like so. We can close our JSX expression within the single, I guess, element, as opposed to typing it out this way. Both ways work, but this is a little more succinct. Now that we have both the props defined inside the component that we're passing it from and the component that we're passing it to, we should see it render. Let's get rid of that. Let's similarly, what the hell just happened? Sorry, I have way too many things open. Is this the right window? All right, there it is. Similarly, we can utilize the structured props. So let's see what that looks like. Instead of typing out props like so, we would type out the props manually. We have a name and we have a title. So when we're passing out props manually like this, we just want to pass it a props parameter. And here is what we actually pass the properties through. So now we can create a little dictionary where the name will equal, using colons instead of equal signs, the value that we want to pass in, and a comma to separate the two key value pairs. Again, a colon instead of an equals, and we will remove these curly brackets here. So far, so good. If I were to save, oops. If I were to save, this would stop rendering because now it's not receiving the props properly. And this is because we no longer need to call props in front of the name and title because we have destructured the props object. So if I were to save this, or save this, I was hoping that it would render. Let's see what's going on here. Let's look inside our console. Yeah, we're div. Why are we not seeing it's in props? Give a name, title. Not throwing any errors. Okay, so we're seeing hello world, but our you have H1 style. That's weird. It looks just like how I had in my other example. Let's try. Okay, sorry. I'm not sure why this isn't working, but let's move on. We'll go back to, we'll worry about destructuring props again later. I'll troubleshoot this while y'all are working on your challenges. In the meantime, we'll go back to calling this the first way, the non-destructured way. And
Is it because you're not destructuring it? Shouldn't equal props go after it?
which line?
13. Well, you don't declare props right there, do you? Don't you just pass it into the profile function?
Well, yeah, that's what you could do if you weren't destructuring it. So like, let's say if I was to say props here,
Wouldn't you destructure it inside of the profile function?
when you destructure it inside of the profile, how would you pass it?
So I would get rid of all the brackets in there and just put name equals Bruce Wayne, and then title equals whatever that's supposed to equal.
Mhm.
And then I'd go down to the profile function, and then I would make a like a const, and then I'd put in brackets, I would put name and title, and then I'd say equals props after I pass in props to the, yeah, right there.
Well, we have a rendering, so you were right about passing it in just as these values here. So I'm gonna have to update my slide deck with this.
I think it's rendering because it's still is it still props.name and props.title?
No, it's just name and title now.
Oh, okay. Weird.
Yeah, that's the short way to destructure.
Oh yeah, I guess you could pass in props and then destructure it that way, or you could do it like that.
Right.
Cool.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. But yes, ultimately there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to pass your props around. So don't get lost in debugging, troubleshooting hell. Stick to a method that you're familiar with, comfortable with, and works for you. So now that we have our profile rendering, let's work on rendering some of these other components. I think we've also created an experiences component, basically, which will take the values that we are importing. So let's get our import back up here. We've got an import for our experiences and our technologies from our constants.js file inside of our assets folder. And this is what we stepped through a little earlier, where there's a constants.js file. In the end, I'm exporting the objects inside of here. And it is also importing from this folder of images, which has its own index.js to essentially convert these file names to something I could use inside the constants.js file inside this list of objects. So with that, we now import it inside of our app.jsx, and we can use experiences and technologies. So within our experiences function, we've got a simple div that has work history listed, and then we use the map function, the JavaScript map function, to iterate through the experiences list and to enumerate as we move along. And it maps every entry inside of this list to these next three divs, which use the title with an index from the enumeration to create a key for each element inside of our HTML, inside of our DOM later on. And we have experiences.title, experiences.company name, experiences.date to pull in the values of our objects into this component. And then for the points, which itself is a list. So when nesting a list within this greater list, we can use the unlisted class in HTML with list items for each individual bullet point. Let's see. And now if we were to enable this within our app components, it's called exp, save. We now have our data from our constants.js file. Similarly with our tech component, we've imported from the constants.js. We have the built-in JavaScript method map to iterate through the list of technologies and icons, and it maps each icon and technology name to a div and image. So now let's enable this. And we now have our little icons. If you notice, I am using inline CSS because I didn't feel like creating a CSS file. Ultimately, it's better practice to not do so much inline styling. Once I were to finish coding all of this out, I would go through, create a CSS file, and convert all of my inline styling to proper CSS styling. And the last thing we want to do for this exercise is create some way to load and unload all of this information. And we do this conditional rendering using a ternary. So in order to have this ternary, we need to have a state that it works off of, and that's where this loaded comes in. This is state creation within functional components, which you've already went over. It uses a built-in useState hook to set the default state of the isLoaded Boolean, and it uses setIsLoaded to adjust that Boolean. So how would this ternary look? We basically want to ask, is loaded true or false. And if it is true, then we will have one set of conditions, and if it's false, we have another set of conditions. In our first set of conditions, we're going to start a div. We'll give it a name of something like the portfolio. Let's close that off. And within this div, we then want to call the profile. Actually, the profile experiences and tech components. So let's drag those down over there. And then in the second half of our ternary, we're going to create a button where on click, we will create an anonymous function call pointing to this set is loaded setter. And we are going to use this to change the value of the is loaded Boolean to the opposite of what it currently is using our bang character. And this button will say load portfolio. We'll also want a similar button inside of our first half of the ternary saying hide portfolio. And just for the sake of cleanliness, let's have a break to separate this button from the rest of the profile. So now I've saved. We see that everything's been replaced by the second half of the ternary because we have a default value for is loaded. We click the button, is loaded becomes true, and we have a hide portfolio button. Any questions? Cool. There are going to be 2 challenges today, both fairly easy. I think knowing how quickly this class picks up new material, you should be able to blaze through them both. So let's just run through these real quick. We're in React. We are in week 16, day 3. And the first exercise is a state abbreviator. Don't mind this document. It's a little outdated. It says to use create React app, but you're going to want to use Vite instead because Vite is a lot better, which is why it's so popular and used so frequently these days. You'll have a smaller project overall in terms of file size with Vite, and it should install a little more quickly. In the first release, you'll be moving the state data inside of this repo, a file in that directory called index.js, to your newly created React app. You'll want to place it inside of the source directory because anything outside of the source directory will not be compiled. And from there, you want to import the state data from this file and use it to construct a user interface. This interface will include a select and drop-down menu for all of the US states and a component that displays the abbreviation of each US state. Very simple. The next challenge will be to create an application using panels, very similar to what we did just now, minus, well, actually, no, not minus, very simple to what we just demoed. You'll be creating panels that render different items from a list of objects, and you will be using a ternary to open and close each panel. I'll let you do these challenges side by side. I'm going to open up some breakout rooms and we will get together at the end of the day to troubleshoot / go over some of your solutions. How does that sound? Cool. If there are no questions, I'm going to open up some breakout rooms. I'm going to stop sharing and I am going to cut the recording.